Hello world. So I am starting this YouTube channel, resurrecting this YouTube channel. I did previously make one video about privatisation of the NHS several years ago, but I'm going to try and resurrect this channel in order to respond to a YouTuber called Vlad Vexler. So let's take a look at Vlad Vexler. This is his about page. I guess I probably should subscribe to him and press the bell button if I'm going to be replying to him on a regular basis. Let's take a look at his about. Description. You are so welcome here. My mission is to guide you through the political challenges we all face in the 21st century. I'm a philosopher, my academic life focuses on the concept of freedom, and I'm writing a book about Isaiah Berlin. I'm a British citizen living in London. I was born in Soviet Russia. I left before the collapse of the USSR. I continue to closely analyse Russian politics. Check out my second channel, Vlad Vexler Chat, where I do Q&As and go into more depth with almost daily content. I also have specialist channels, Vlad Vexler Philosophy and Vlad Vexler Music. I do some work in musicology. My content is informed by my experience living with a debilitating neurological condition. I believe he suffers from ME. I contracted it 20 years ago as a research student at Oxford. For years I couldn't walk, talk or read. I manage this condition daily, and it gives me a unique perspective on disability, the tragic element in life, as well as the beauty. So I think that Vlad Vexler is a lovely guy. I do feel a certain fondness for him on the basis of watching his YouTube videos. I certainly have compassion for him with regards to his struggles with ME. None of what I will be putting out through this channel should be interpreted by anyone as a personal attack on Vlad. Vlad, if you ever hear this video or any of my other subsequent videos, please know that I like you as a human being. However, I profoundly disagree with Vlad's take on the Russia-Ukraine war. I am myself an anti-war leftist, and I'm concerned that Vlad is misleading a lot of people through his pro-war take. I almost said anti-war take, that would be wishful thinking. Through his pro-war analysis offered with what appears to be a considerable degree of sensitivity. So I am not happy about this state of affairs. I am hoping to reach at least 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 of the people watching Vlad's videos to expose the superficiality of his analysis. It sounds clever, but it's really not nearly as clever as it sounds, in my personal, not so humble opinion. So without further ado, let us take a look at the first video which I will be responding to, which is Vlad's video. No, not that one. Vlad's video regarding leftists. Okay, so let's go to videos. So he's released a video 4 days ago entitled How Putin Fooled the Western Left, and I wish now to respond to it. I do apologise about the quality of this video, but I'm just going to go for this, and hopefully if you're interested in my message you will forgive the likely poor audio and video quality of it. At least I hope you will. Let's give it a go, shall we? See how we get on.
Hey, Georgie. Hey, Georgie. Hey, Georgie.
Sorry about
Hey, Georgie. Just wanted to welcome you to the
Chomsky, Jeffrey Sachs. Let's talk about why the anti-imperialist Western left is soft on Putin's extreme imperialist violence. We're talking tight.
So I don't agree with Vlad that the anti-imperialist West are soft on Putin's imperialist violence. He's using presuppositions here. Perhaps I will make a future video to explain the meaning of that.
Of left intelligentsia, Noam Chomsky, Jeffrey Sachs, Cornel West, Richard Wolff. And we're also talking about the so-called alt-left, Glenn Greenwald, Aaron Mattei, Tulsi Gabbard, Matt Taibbi. All these voices failed to get what Putin's politics is all about. They're skeptical of support in Ukraine, and they don't see how Russia's imperialist implosion threatens us in the West. We're going to
Okay, so Vlad is layering presupposition upon presupposition. Presupposition, okay, is when something is assumed to be true in the comment you make. And he does this so much that it's impossible to respond to all of them. But just know that Vlad is laying it on thick with presuppositions, things that he thinks we should all assume to be true, which really we should not assume to be true. We should be questioning thoughtfully.
Lovingly expose their ideas, ask why they're misguided and what the real world consequences are. To understand how Putin fooled the Western left over Ukraine, we have to turn back to
This is just so ridiculous. Putin did not fool the Western left over Ukraine. The Western left aren't listening to Putin. They're listening to each other, okay? They do not listen to what Putin says. They listen to each other and they listen to the evidence. Okay, so the framing is just ridiculous, absurd, stupid. Sorry, Vlad. And Vlad supporters, it's just stupid.
Tumultuous months before the invasion. On 17 December 2021, Putin issued an ultimatum to the West which made it clear that he thought that all of Eastern Europe should be his sphere of influence.
Good afternoon, dear.
No, he didn't. Rubbish.
A week later, he upped the ante at an annual press conference in Moscow.
We said not an inch to the east. That was the NATO guarantee in 1990. So what became of that? They fooled us. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We witnessed 5 waves of NATO expansion. Why can't they understand? What is unclear? I believe everything is clear. We are thinking about our own security.
Putin concludes we are not threatening anybody so long as we get Eastern Europe back and so long as the West makes...
This is insufferable. This really is insufferable nonsense. Putin not wanting NATO to expand east of Germany. That was the Russian position, is they didn't want NATO to expand east of Germany. Gorbachev accepted that as a consequence of German reunification, Eastern Germany would de facto become a part of NATO, but he did not want NATO to expand eastward. Beyond that, but saying that they don't want NATO to expand eastward beyond that does not mean that they want Russian control over those countries. It just means they want them to be militarily neutral. So this is a deeply dishonest framing. Okay.
Amends for fooling us about not 1 inch of NATO expansion to the east. Whether that promise was really made, we'll come back to later. What Putin is really saying is we resent the outside world for being mean to us. The United States runs everything and we resent it, and we demand a new international order now. This was just the latest in a long line of Putin's increasingly radical statements on NATO. But to many it felt like a key moment. Russia observers were beginning to feel that Putin might really be on the warpath.
Russian armour is massing near the border with Ukraine. At the same time, Moscow is demanding an end to NATO enlargement and NATO military activity in Eastern Europe.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is blaming the US and NATO for worsening tensions in Eastern Europe.
He does not want a war, but he's demanding immediate guarantees from the US and NATO.
But for many leftist thinkers, Putin's stated concerns about Russia's security were legitimate and needed to be taken at face value. And when they listened to Putin's incredible list of demands, they bought Putin's suggestion that what he was asking for wasn't that much.
Noam, a massive honour to have you.
Just a few months
joining us
later,
today.
in May 2022, the famous philosopher, scientist and moralist Noam Chomsky went on leftist journalist Owen Jones's podcast and essentially blamed the war on American interventions.
The State Department officially stated that in the period up to the invasion, the U.S. refused to consider any Russian security concerns. Okay?
In Chomsky's view, Russia's security grievances caused by successive US administrations breaking that promise to not expand NATO 1 inch to the east were ignored, while Putin's stated goals in Ukraine, demilitarization, neutralization, were exaggerated by the US propaganda system to seem less legitimate than they were. Meanwhile, the US rode roughshod over Ukraine's desire for peace with its aggressive neighbor.
The record all the way through is that Ukraine seeking some kind of peaceful settlement, the U.S. refusing to accept it, and in fact moving the opposite direction to undermine it, and Britain, of course, Blairist Britain, politely shining Washington's shoes.
In this view, the war is largely a product of American actions imposed on Ukraine and Russia. Here is Jeffrey Sachs, the economist and public policy expert.
So, Vlad is correct in suggesting that the war is not simply a result of American policy imposed on Ukraine. It is indeed a little more complicated than that, just as the war is not a result of Russian imperialism being imposed on Ukraine. So the situation is that basically Ukraine was, and in a sense still is, a very ethnically divided country. There are hardcore Ukrainian nationalists, and there are many ethnic Russians there, especially in the east of the country. Also a lot of ethnic Russians in places as far west as Odessa even. There are also other ethnic groups, Hungarians and others. But the main ethnic groups are of relevance are of course the Ukrainian nationalists and the ethnic Russians. And this was a very delicate situation. It was a situation that needed to be handled with sensitivity, that needed to be handled with regard to the legitimate concerns and aspirations of both ethnic groups, and that needed to be handled with a degree of even-handedness. And the US administration, or the US government in administration after administration, did the exact opposite of that. They aggressively backed anti-Russian Ukrainian nationalists. And it's that unholy alliance between anti-Russian US administrations with an anti-Russian agenda, and anti-Russian Ukrainian nationalists, and of course indeed pro-Russian ethnic Russians and Russia, this unholy coming together of all of these forces that has given rise to this terrible war. Let's continue.
But Jeffrey says that the American neocon project of creating a unipolar American world, which is what led to NATO expanding right up till Russia's border, is in good part responsible for Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
The explicit
And he's absolutely correct in saying that. Please, if you have not yet done so, listen to Jeffrey Sachs. Very, very clever, wise guy.
goal was to surround Russia in the Black Sea. President Putin came in. He was not anti-European. He was not anti-American. What he saw, though, was the incredible arrogance of the United States, the expansion of NATO, the wars in Iraq, the covert war in Syria, the war in Libya against the UN resolution. So we created so much of what we're facing right now through our own ineptitude and arrogance. There was no linear determination. It was step-by-step U.S. arrogance that has helped to bring us to where we are today.
That's the left. But what about the alt left? The alt left is sociologically different from the left, but it largely uses the same arguments. If the left is driven by traditional critiques of US imperialism, the alt left is driven by participation in the culture.
Again, you know, Vlad is layering presupposition upon presupposition. He is assuming that he has the authority to define what the alt-left is and who is part of it, and I would just encourage people not to take this terribly seriously, because it really is just Vlad's rhetoric rather than an objective description of an objective truth.
Wars and responsiveness to the crisis of trust in public institutions in the West. So it's here goes the evil American empire again versus our institutions are corrupt and we can't trust anything they do anymore. Here is Tulsi Gabbard.
So what we're seeing play out now is essentially a proxy war. U.S. is engaging in a proxy war with Russia, waging this war using the Ukrainian military and people as their chess pieces in this geopolitical chess game. The ultimate objective being regime change with Russia.
They're all arguing that since the war was America's to start and profit from, it is also America's to end. A key facet of the Western left's critique is that it is possible to off-ramp, that opportunities for peace have been missed and sabotaged, and that a solution is still available if we pursue negotiations and diplomacy. Here is a...
This is perhaps Vlad's strongest point in the entire video. His skepticism about the possibility of a ceasefire and peace agreement. It is indeed it's a tricky situation that we're in right now, given the very, very high levels of mutual distrust on both sides. And this is an important point that needs to be analysed and thought about largely separately from the whys and wherefores of the causes of the conflict itself. The person I would recommend taking a look at to understand this side of things better is an author and YouTuber called William Spaniel. I recommend his YouTube videos. I recommend also his book on the causes of the Ukraine war and how it will end. I actually don't agree with his explanation of the cause of the Ukraine war, but I think that his explanation of the possibilities of a diplomatic settlement are essential reading for anyone who is seriously interested in understanding this conflict and how it can, in principle, end. William Spaniel is definitely pro-Ukrainian. He is not, like myself, anti-US imperialist, anti-NATO expansion, as I definitely am. But nonetheless, he has some very, very valuable points to make on this particular point, and I will give him credit for that. I hope I will always have the honesty and intellectual integrity to give people credit where I think it's due, regardless of whether or not I agree with him about everything. Let's continue.
Economist and public intellectual Richard Wolff.
My conclusion, and that of many around the world: stop it. End this war. Sit down the two sides. Work out an acceptable agreement. Anything is safer and better for the world than continuing down the unknowable, dangerous path that we are now on.
And here is Chomsky again.
Possibly there's one way to bring the agony to an end quickly. That's negotiations and diplomacy. There's no other way. That means, in this case, offering Putin some kind of escape hatch, some way to get out without admitting total defeat. That's diplomacy. Well, if you reject it, you're carrying out a grotesque experiment, gambling with the lives of Ukrainians, and in fact the world. And that's the experiment that the US and Britain are undertaking.
Chomsky has roots in Ukraine. His father was born there, and he is a significant intellectual outside the realm of politics. And some of the other people, maybe people you admire, you have a relationship with, but they are not right. First, no,
Vlad, they are right. You are not right.
Most centrally, they are misreading why Putin invaded Ukraine. And because they are misreading why the war began, they're unable to understand the ongoing dynamics driving the conflict. So let's go back.
According to you, of course, we disagree.
To Putin's December 2021 ultimatum and the causes of the war. Everything we've seen from the left and from the alt-left tends to capture the causes of the war in terms of Russia's national security as expressed in Putin's ultimatum. But in reality, it's a lot more complex than that. There are two...
It is indeed a lot more complex than that. There are multiple causes of the war. The book that I would recommend is How the West Brought War to Ukraine, by Benjamin Abloh. That's one. And also, bear with me please, I have a full-time job and will not be editing this video, so you'll have to be very patient. The other one is War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. I recommend reading both of those books. They explore the multiple causes of this war. It is indeed more complex than Western expansionism. We also have everything that was happening in the Donbass, the Minsk II agreement, Zelensky's failure to honour the terms of the Minsk II agreement to allow elections for regional autonomy within the separatist regions, and instead to amass forces and to threaten to recapture those areas by force, which is certainly one of, if not the main cause of this conflict.
Primary explanatory pillars driving the causation of the war, and actually neither of them can be mapped onto NATO expansion. Let's start with the first pillar, regime security. Russia's invasion of...
So again, all of this is just Vlad's sort of the fictional narrative that Vlad has spun around this. and it just shouldn't be taken terribly seriously. You know, he speaks well, he speaks sensitively, he comes across as a nice guy, but he's just peddling his own little fictions. So I'm going to speed this up because I won't have very much to say about it really, other than that it shouldn't be taken too seriously. So I'm going to put it on 1.5 speed.
Of Ukraine in 2014 and the full-scale invasion in 2022 were done in good part to avert regime erosion at home. In the pre-2022
No, they weren't. Nonsense.
world, Putin was playing president by outsourcing his presidential powers to his court and then arbitrating, refereeing conflicts within his court. And at one point he felt that his refereeing powers had shrunk, and to gain them back, he thought he needed war.
No, nonsense. Just, you know, don't take this terribly seriously. It really doesn't deserve to be taken terribly seriously.
There is another fact. Putin felt that the younger generation was drifting away from him, and he could put a lid on top of them via a war. Putin hoped, and he still does, that a big conflict against the West, a militarization of Russian society, will allow him to skip a generation, bringing it about that today's Russian children grow up to become Putin supporters. The second pillar.
Yeah, Vlad is just full of hatred and disdain for Putin, but this is all speculative and a product of his own hatred of Putin. It doesn't deserve to be taken seriously.
Of the explanation for war is about national security, kind of, but not in the way our leftist heroes would have us believe. Putin's conception of national security is both more radical and more mystical than their understanding allows. Between 2010 and 2014, Putin developed a sense of mission, and Putin, the amateur historian, began making self-aggrandizing ventures into the past, looking for role models for himself. And he came to think, perhaps à la Tsar Alexander III, that he was special. He got the feeling that Russia's cultural destiny was now tied to the will of a single individual, Mr. Putin. This sense of mission came years after the 2007 siege at the...
Okay, so Putin likes to romanticize about Russia, but that wasn't the cause of this war. It just wasn't. Folks, please just don't take this too seriously. It's just Vlad peddling his little theories.
The Munich Security Conference. There, Putin too wanted to reject the post-Cold War European settlement, but his later rejection of it took on a more mystical quality. The left, and to be fair, many in the West, deal with the Putin regime as though it were Brezhnev, whereas in fact it is closer to being something like a radical terror organization, invoking holy values to justify violence. But here we have to...
Just nonsense. Complete nonsense.
Concede a point and allow nuance. NATO expansion was handled badly, and Western leaders like Bill Clinton knew that when they were doing it. Before we tackle this, let's clarify the infamous not 1 inch to the east promise. Was there a promise? Promises were made repeatedly, but they weren't formalized. So here is my analysis. A politician can promise another politician something by saying, but
well, let's slow this down. It's a little bit more serious. Okay, slowed down to normal speed.
State cannot promise another state something without formalizing it on paper. And when we look at the formality, we see that the Kremlin signed a treaty explicitly allowing the expansion of Article 5 eastward. When Putin says that Russia got fooled, he is half right. Mr. Gorbachev got fooled because he was an extraordinary leader and a poor negotiator, but the Soviet Union, being a state, didn't get fooled because states don't make promises to each other that aren't on paper. And what then followed was that the East European countries wanted to run away from Moscow.
Okay, so whether it's states getting fooled or Russians getting fooled, I think we can agree that Russian politicians were antagonized by the behavior of the US and its allies in expanding NATO further and further eastwards, and that's really all that needs to be established. That's what antagonized, one of the many things that antagonized Russia. Of course, if you want to learn about the many other things that antagonized Russia, please read Benjamin Abloh, read War in Ukraine, making sense of a senseless conflict. It is indeed a complex picture.
Moscow and join their own security elements. Because when Russia invaded Ukraine and nearly took Kiev in 2022, this wasn't the first time. There was Budapest in 56, there's Prague in 68, and there is Poland in 81, when there weren't Russian tanks in Warsaw, but there were Polish tanks ordered from Moscow.
So what is Vlad even saying here? It wasn't the first time. Is he saying that the reason all of these somehow have a common cause? And it just doesn't make sense. Like a lot of what Vlad says, it sounds weighty, but when you try to parse it, you kind of realize that he's just not constructing a clear, even trying to construct a clear argument.
But as Mary Surratt argues in her path-breaking book, the problem wasn't that NATO expanded, the problem was how NATO expanded.
Okay, no. The problem was that NATO expanded. Let's be clear, Russia did not want a hostile military alliance on its border. It did not want hostile military alliance moving closer and closer to its border.
For example, there was a possibility of a more rapid but more diffuse expansion, which is what Clinton wanted, partly because it would avoid creating a line by leaving Ukraine on the wrong end of it. Either way, as Mary Surratt argues, nothing was more conducive to radicalizing Russia than expanding NATO in small tranches. But while...
So Vlad seems to be making some sort of concession to the point of view of the anti-war left by making that point. Perhaps we disagree. Perhaps we agree that they antagonize.
While this radicalized Russia, NATO expansion is not a primary cause of war. Centering it doesn't account for the domestic regime's security causes of war, and as we have seen, reducing Putin...
It's not the only cause of war. Far from it. There are many other factors involved. As I've acknowledged, we have to look at everything that was happening over the preceding 8 years, including and especially the conflict in the Donbass, and the fact that the terms of the Minsk II agreement were not honoured by the Ukrainians. Their agreement to allow elections on regional autonomy within the separatist regions. And instead of allowing those elections, they were amassing troops on the border of those regions and threatening to retake them by force.
Sense of mission to grievances about NATO expansion over-instrumentalizes his worldview. We are not looking at a guy who wants to alter a couple of moves on a board game. We're looking at a guy who wants to take the board game and throw it off the table. And there is something else that the NATO expansion did it argument implies, and that is that Putin's imperialistic death spiral serves Russia's national interest. But any thinking Russian should know that Putin's actions are destroying Russia's future and increasing...
You know, again, what Vlad is doing here, he's just piling non sequitur on top of non sequitur. Something that doesn't make sense on top of something that doesn't, is being piled on top of something that doesn't follow from something that doesn't make sense. All I can say, folks, is it would take an inordinate amount of time to even try to pass Vlad's argument, but if you can't understand what he's saying, it's probably because he's not really making sense. He's good at rhetoric. He's employing fancy rhetoric. His actual arguments, are just ridiculous a lot of the time.
The odds that Russia may not exist at all.
Okay,
And there is an even more striking omission in that argument, and that is Ukrainian agency. Since 2014, Ukraine has come together in a civic bond powered by anti-colonial sentiment. And it's only an ungrounded newspaper clipping approach to political understanding that could lead...
Clearly, Ukraine has not come together since 2014. Ukraine has been incredibly divided from 2014 right up until the outbreak of war. If Ukraine had been united, there would be no war. Everything in the Donbass would have been settled peacefully. Again, this is just nonsense. It's rubbish. Counterfactual nonsense.
Noam Chomsky to say that Ukraine wants peace more than weapons. Likewise, both...
Okay, so Vlad has a point here. If Noam Chomsky says Ukraine wants peace more than weapons, he's not necessarily correct about that, of course. There are undoubtedly many Ukrainians who want to keep on fighting, but we have to bear in mind that Ukraine is not functioning as a democracy at the moment. There's currently a Ukrainian pacifist who has been arrested for treasonous activities for opposing the war. 12 opposition parties have been banned, so we cannot really know for certainty what Ukrainians think, because they are not free to express themselves as they might wish to. But regardless of whether or not Ukrainians want war or peace, I think that we in the West are entitled to make an intelligent decision about what we think is in everyone's best interests, including our own. We don't have to assume that we have to do whatever the most aggressive Ukrainian nationalist wants us to do. That's a ridiculous supposition that would never be accepted in any other conflict situation that we were not directly party to.
Putin's sense of regime security and his sense of mission are not compatible with an off-ramp. My interpretation is that Putin wants a big war against the West, but in several years from now.
Vlad's most ridiculous, most unsubstantiated statement of this whole video. Folks, please do not take this guy overly seriously. He hates Vladimir Putin. He is not offering an objective, impartial, fact-based commentary on what is going on in this situation.
Meanwhile, he wants a low-level, minimally globalized war, during which Western support for Ukraine exhausts itself and Western democracies begin to collapse. And then Putin can act from a position of strength. The left's strongest case is the risk of global nuclear Armageddon.
A nuclear war could break out in a week, in 30 days. We are staring over the precipice of that nuclear brink now, more than ever before. It would spark...
Okay, so it bears mentioning that, Vlad's assertion that the West's strongest case is the danger of nuclear war is a implied criticism of everything else the anti-war left says. Again, just recognize that he's employing rhetorics here and don't take it too seriously. Rhetoric. He's employing a rhetorical device here.
Spark World War III, and the result of that is destruction of the world.
My own assessment is that Russia indeed poses a high global nuclear risk. This is the left's strongest argument, but I have a couple of responses. One, the Biden administration has been extremely conservative at nuclear escalation management. That is why we've seen, with each new weapon given to Ukraine, first a toe in the door, then 2 toes, then 3, and then eventually a small quantity of weapons is delivered. Second, Ukraine retaking Crimea would increase global nuclear risk. But Ukraine...
Okay, so Vlad has said that Ukraine retaking Crimea would increase global nuclear risk. No, Vlad, Ukraine seriously threatening to retake Crimea would increase global nuclear risk. Russia strategically cannot afford to lose Crimea because Crimea is home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet, which is Russia's only freshwater fleet. They also, within Russia, they have one in Syrian territory as well. They regard it as a strategically essential for them to maintain their base in Sevastopol, and therefore strategically essential for them to maintain control of Crimea. And as many commentators have said, they may very, very well choose to use tactical nuclear weapons if they feel that they cannot defend Crimea using conventional weaponry alone.
Not retaking Crimea, Ukraine not retaking its territories, Ukraine, God forbid, losing Kiev, which is currently impossible, would actually lead to massive Russian escalation and high nuclear risk.
Okay, this is just a completely unsubstantiated assertion. Again, undoubtedly it makes sense on planet Vlad Vexler, but it's not a serious argument. He's not even trying to put together an argument. He's making an assertion with as much confidence as he can and hoping that you will somehow be persuaded by it. Please, folks, he's a nice guy, but he really does not deserve to be taken terribly seriously.
However we weigh nuclear risk, we are exchanging nuclear risk today for nuclear risk tomorrow. There is no...
Yeah, it's just nonsense. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. What he's saying makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. For as long as the conflict remains active, for as long as the West just pours weaponry into Ukraine that is being used to strike targets in Russia, there's a serious nuclear risk. If we agree a ceasefire deal, if we agree some sort of demilitarized zone, if we hopefully, in an ideal world, create some sort of arms control agreement between Russia and NATO, whereby neither side has nuclear missiles pointing at the other. Of course, all of these things are steps in the direction of de-escalating nuclear risk. Vlad, folks, is just talking complete nonsense.
Nuclear risk-free way of standing up to Putin's imperialistic aggression.
Okay, so again, Vlad is relying upon rhetoric and presuppositions. We, the anti-war left, do not accept the premise that Putin is engaging in imperialist aggression as such. That framing of what he's doing implies that what Putin is doing is unprovoked. Certainly, we agree that what he is doing is profoundly wrong, profoundly immoral, most of us would probably be happy to use the word unjustified in that alternative peaceful options were in principle available to him, but certainly not unprovoked, certainly not an unprovoked imperialist invasion.
And now we're getting to the elephant in the room. We need to zoom out and look at the left's relationship with America. Here is the humanist public intellectual and presidential candidate Cornel West causally centering American imperialism in the run-up to the war.
NATO is an instrument of American imperial foreign policy. We've seen it over and over again, and so we're witnessing a proxy war.
They view all US action abroad as imperialist, and in some cases as a product of US corporate capitalism. Their views are profoundly US-centric. They think two things. First, imperialism is always bad. Second, their working, implicit definition of imperialism is American-centric. Imperialism just is what America does abroad. Paradoxically, their US-centric anti-imperialism blinds them to the horrors of Russian imperialism. And it also blinds them to the constructiveness of US power in Ukraine. What they miss about imperialism, if we call the United States an empire, is that...
Okay, so needless to say, I disagree with what Vlad is saying here.
Not all
but let's continue.
Empires are equally bad, and some global problems can...
Okay, this is a statement that is just too overgeneralized to be of any to offer any illumination as to what is going on in this situation. Again, Vlad is using rhetorics here.
Cannot be solved without the projection of imperial power. US imperial power is the only vehicle.
Again, Vlad is making an assertion, but he is not backing up his assertion with any type of reason or argument. Please do not take this too seriously, folks.
Stopping Mr. Putin's aggression. The truth is that the US empire is good and bad, and we need it to be good, and it is good now in Ukraine, while Russian imperialism...
We disagree. I don't think it is good. I think that it has been not necessarily the cause of this war, but it has been the touch paper that has led to this war and the cause of its perpetuation.
Is, as we have seen, irredeemably nihilistic and caught up in a destructive and self-destructive death.
Vlad is just indulging in his hatred of Putin. Undoubtedly, Putin has many faults. Undoubtedly, there is a lot of corruption in Russia. Undoubtedly, Putin's democratic opponents have been treated unfairly. But Putin's Russia is not irredeemably nihilistic. You know, there are lots of ordinary people in Russia doing lots of very ordinary things, getting on with their life. Russia is a multi-ethnic country. There are members of many, many different religions and ethnicities in Russia. They are free to pursue their cultural and religious traditions as they wish, and Vlad is just indulging in his hatred of Putin here, basically. Please, folks, don't take this too seriously.
Death spiral. The bottom line is that in denying the agency of other countries, in over-exaggerating America's indeed pervasive hand in everything, the leftist heroes of our video end up paying US imperialism a compliment in reverse. In lampooning American power in such a reductionist way, Noam Chomsky and our other heroes fall into the very Americanocentrism they're trying to critique. But
Vlad is just using rhetoric here. It's really not clear what he's saying or what he isn't saying. Folks, please just don't take any of this too seriously.
But that's not a reason to cancel them. So what do we have to say in defense of those we have critiqued? First,
that's not a reason to cancel the left. Okay, thank you, Vlad, for being so gracious. Again, he's just trying to position himself as the good guy here. Folks, please just try and to see through these type of subtly disingenuous rhetorical tactics.
Many on the left do not share the mistakes of the heroes of this video. Ask a Polish or a Ukrainian leftist about the realities of Mr. Putin's imperialism, and they'll tell you what's up. Second,
okay, so Vlad is suggesting that Ukrainian and Polish leftists all hate Putin and think he's an imperialist. If so, Vlad, why is it that Ukrainian pacifists are facing charges of treason in Zelensky's Ukraine? Why is it that my Polish Facebook friend holds the same views as I do on this matter? Vlad is just simply wrong to suggest that there is a single unitary Polish or Ukrainian left. There isn't. There are leftists in Poland and Ukraine who have a wide range of opinions about this matter, just as they do in all other countries.
It would be unhealthy to have nobody in the position that is always opposed to all US war making. If you support Ukraine, your opponents on the soft on Putin Western left could be your allies another day. 3.
Oh, how gracious of you, Vlad. Again, I think he's just really trying to position himself as the good, reasonable guy here. I struggle to think he is trying to be do anything, trying to show any particular kindness to us. I don't know. Maybe he means it. Maybe I'm being a little ungenerous to Vlad on this particular point.
The alt-left's warning about collapsing trust in our institutions is valid, and it's healthy if they remind us that, in principle, a correct policy abroad could become wrong if it destabilizes democracy at home. 4. We share a table of politics, and we don't get to win an argument by declaring that we've won it. That said, the left...
I rather think that Vlad is guilty of thinking that he's won arguments and particular points by declaring that he's won them.
Left's poor analysis costs. It costs us, it costs our democracy, it costs Ukraine, it costs Eastern Europe, and it even costs Russia. It would...
How, Vlad? How does the West's analysis cost all of those people, all of those groups? The fact of the matter is that the anti-war left possesses no political power whatsoever. It possesses no power over government decision-making with regard to Ukraine. Again, it just doesn't make sense, you know. His arguments just do not make sense. They do not stack up. They sound persuasive because he delivers them confidently and persuasively, but they just don't make a great deal of sense.
Be a catastrophe for Eastern Europe and for the West if a part of Eastern Europe were lost to a tyrant sitting atop an imploding empire. Putin...
No, Vlad, it will not be a tragedy for Western Europe and Eastern Europe if Ukraine cedes territory to Russia. It just won't. it doesn't directly affect people living in Manchester. It does not directly affect people living in Bordeaux in France. It does not directly affect people living in Warsaw or Poland. It affects Ukrainians, and it affects people living in those areas, and it's a sad state of affairs indeed. But we're in a situation now where there's no good option. There is really no good option, and we're having to choose between the least bad option in the circumstances, and the least bad option in the circumstances, it seems, is some type of negotiated settlement in which Ukraine cedes some of its land, some of its pre-2022 February 2022 borders, some of its pre-2022 land to Russia in exchange for peace. Okay.
Threatens our national security, not just Ukraine's, and we need to
nonsense
plan and strategize accordingly. Now, an obvious question coming
nonsense
out of this is, how on earth did Russia end up in this disastrous place? To understand the cultural and historical journey that got Russia here, watch this video now.
Please, well, do not watch any videos of Vlad Vexler uncritically. This guy is very, very slippery, and he really does not deserve to be taken seriously, folks. Again, I like him as a human being. He comes across as a nice person. I have compassion for him with regards to his ME. Sure, he's a nice guy on a human level, but he is a highly, highly deceptive commentator with regards to this particular issue. So that's all I have got to say for video 1, and if you have listened to this, thank you very, very much, and please leave a comment and a reaction. Cheers. Thank you. Until next time.